This is Maya Ellis, and today we're breaking down one of the most important choke points in the world.
If the Strait of Hormuz closes, roughly 20% of the entire global oil supply immediately stops moving. Standard macroeconomic assumptions dictate that a choke point closure of this magnitude guarantees universal devastation, crushing both the regional producers who cannot sell their oil and the global buyers starved of energy. However, a March 2026 economic model by Wachtmeister, Gars, and Spiro proves that the actual fallout from a Hormuz blockade is violently asymmetrical. This chart shows the projected lost export revenues for Gulf states during a blockade. While nations entirely dependent on the strait, like Kuwait and Iraq, face massive economic contractions, Saudi Arabia actually generates a net profit from the crisis. This chart tracks producer profit relative to GDP, revealing a second anomaly. Russia, operating entirely outside the Gulf, captures a massive economic windfall, increasing its GDP by up to 11%. On the consumer side, the disparities are equally severe. Despite facing the exact same global price spikes, India's economy plunges toward recession, while Europe remains highly insulated from the shock. Mapping the true geoeconomics of a choke point requires looking past simple export volumes. The actual economic outcomes are determined by pipeline bypass capacity, the decay of sanctions, and macroeconomic oil intensity. Geographic choke points do not destroy economies evenly. They act as a centrifuge, separating nations with structural resilience from those with systemic vulnerabilities. To understand Saudi Arabia's anomalous profit, we have to map the physical infrastructure of the Gulf oil market prior to the blockade. Before the disruption, the Gulf exports 21 million barrels per day, often abbreviated as MBD. 18 million of those barrels rely exclusively on seaborne transit directly through the Strait of Hormuz. This diagram maps the region's pipeline bypass capacity. When the 18 million barrel bottleneck is sealed off, the UAE diverts 1.8 million barrels, and Saudi Arabia surges 5 million barrels through terrestrial pipelines to the Red Sea. Subtracting that bypass volume leaves a hard global deficit. The true disruption to the international market is exactly 14.2 million barrels per day. This explains the Saudi paradox. Losing access to their eastern seaports eliminates a massive volume of their daily exports, but it does not destroy their gross domestic product. Because the global market is now starved of 14.2 million barrels, prices skyrocket. The 5 million barrels Saudi Arabia routes to its western ports now sell at an astronomical premium, mathematically offsetting the total volume they lost. In a global supply shock, possessing alternative terrestrial routing transforms a nation from a blockade victim into a premium monopoly supplier. The blockade's effects extend far beyond the Middle East. Producers outside the strait, specifically Russia, experience massive gains. As a net exporter completely unaffected by the physical blockade, Russia immediately captures the baseline global price spike caused by the 14.2 million barrel deficit. But Russia's 11% GDP spike relies on a second, hidden multiplier, the blockade's effect on international sanctions. This chart breaks down the pre-war baseline pricing for Russian crude. Oil sold to China and India carried a $20 per barrel sanctions discount, composed of a $10 buyer discount and a $10 transport cost premium. The economic model factors in buyer behavior during a severe shortage. Desperate global importers abandon these sanctions protocols to secure scarce energy. As the $20 discount evaporates, full market pricing is restored to Russian crude, stacking on top of the elevated global baseline. Geopolitical chaos acts as a ruthless, highly efficient sanctions clearing mechanism, instantly transferring immense wealth back to isolated producers across the globe. While producers outside the choke point extract windfalls, consumer nations must absorb the costs. The Wachtmeister paper introduces a central demand-side metric to calculate exactly who absorbs the most damage, the vulnerability index. It is calculated by dividing net imports by storage and multiplying that by oil consumption over GDP. The first half of the equation measures a nation's strategic buffer. By dividing daily net imports by total inventory, we find exactly how many days an economy can function without new shipments. This chart displays oil inventories divided by daily net imports. The European bloc holds a strategic buffer of roughly 140 days. India holds a buffer of barely 50 days. The second half of the equation calculates oil intensity. This measures oil expenditures as a share of total GDP, revealing how deeply fossil fuels are baked into the baseline economy. This chart measures that oil intensity across major economies. India's economy is highly exposed, with oil expenditures nearing 4% of GDP. The European bloc sits well under 1.5%. These two variables multiply each other. A high-intensity economy with a shallow storage buffer faces severe compounding effects during a price shock. Importer resilience is a strict mathematical equation. It is not determined by sheer economic size or total import volume. This chart illustrates the final vulnerability index scores when those variables are combined. India's bar spikes massively higher than the rest of the analyzed world. Translated into real-world economic impact, India's index score results in a devastating 4% contraction in their GDP. A 4% consumer loss forces massive macroeconomic contagion. Production halts, supply chains completely seize, and the state experiences runaway inflation. This is coupled with severe domestic tension between consumers and local oil producers. By contrast, the European Union escapes the exact same blockade with less than a 2% consumer loss, despite being a massive net oil importer. This chart breaks down producer profit and consumer loss across the European group. Most EU states take only minor losses, and Norway, positioned on the far left, actually extracts a 6% GDP profit due to its domestic production. The broader European bloc survives the shock because decades of policy and infrastructure development have structurally lowered the oil intensity of their GDP. Geographical resources dictate producer power, but policy-driven energy efficiency is the only shield for an importing nation. The economic shock of a blockade is not static. The model proves it behaves radically differently in the short term versus the medium term. In the first phase of the crisis, the IEA releases 5 million barrels per day from emergency global inventories. The IEA is the International Energy Agency, an intergovernmental organization that coordinates energy policies and maintains emergency petroleum reserves. This chart maps global oil price against strategic inventories. The 5 million barrel release acts as an artificial ceiling, holding the price flat at $120 per barrel. But this strategy has a strict limit. The IEA's emergency reserves total roughly 1,200 million barrels. Drawing down 5 million barrels a day means the world runs out of emergency oil in exactly 240 days. During this 240-day window, markets frequently price the disruption as a temporary supply constraint, masking the underlying macroeconomic rot occurring in vulnerable importing nations. Strategic petroleum reserves do not solve a physical supply deficit. They only purchase a temporary delay of the inevitable economic reality. The second phase begins on day 241, the moment global emergency inventories are entirely depleted. Without the buffer, the market hits the hard limits of constant elasticity supply. This means producers cannot easily scale up output to meet missing demand. Once the artificial ceiling vanishes, the price violently steps up from $120 to $158 per barrel. At $158 a barrel, the crisis shifts. It is no longer a temporary market disruption. It becomes a permanent structural wealth transfer. Capital continuously hemorrhages from high-intensity importing nations and flows directly to unblockaded, isolated exporters. In a rivalrous geopolitical landscape, emergency storage is just a stopwatch. True national security requires permanently decoupling economic growth from oil intensity.
Hit the like button and subscribe to my channel to stay informed. Stay ahead. This is Maya Ellis Daily.